Welcome to the 6th podcast for Breaking the Norm. In this episode, we have Dr. Kim Jobst. As you will learn in the podcast, Kim studied medicine at Oxford University and then went on to undertake research into dementia there. The podcast covers a lot, including Kim's background and how he moved away from completely traditional healthcare into integrated medicine. His main publication is Diseases of Meaning, which will be explained in the podcast. And he's gone on to be given a Lifetime Achievement Award from Desmond Tutu and was invited to speak by the Dalai Lama. Whether you agree or not with Kim's views, they are thought-provoking, and I hope you enjoy the podcast. So, Kim, thanks for coming on today.
Pleasure to be here.
So, I want to start with your background. How have you come to be where you are now?
You mean come to be where I am now from a professional point of view? I started life wanting to be in agricultural sciences and forestry, and went up to Oxford to do that. But in my year out, I'd gone ranching in the United States and had a very powerful experience while I was there that made it very, very clear to me that what I really needed to do, what I was really called to do, was to do medicine, but not because I wanted to be a doctor. I've always had an interest in the meaning of life, and I really wanted to know how it works, how human beings work, why people get sick, what enables them to be well, but much more importantly, how life works. And I've avoided medicine. Once I'd finished school, I'd kind of had it with study, and I didn't want to have to commit to a 7-year course unless I was absolutely certain that that's what I wanted to do. So in fact, I turned down a place in Cambridge to do medicine.
Most people are killed for that.
And really very, very much because, I didn't feel I had a right to take a place from somebody who really knew that they wanted to do it. So while I was in the States, it became very clear to me that the way to that discovery for me was going to be in medicine, and for a very simple reason, that as I saw it, medicine was going to confront me, with the things that I find the most difficult to study, which were the sciences, because I had a natural arts sort of gift in a way. And also because it would bring me into contact with people of all walks of life and with all kinds of suffering, and most importantly would bring me face to face with death. And I really wanted to meet death and come to terms with that. So I went back to England, turned around on the ranch, literally the next day I left, came back to England, went up to Oxford and said, I want to do medicine. I don't want to do agricultural sciences and forestry. And as you can imagine, they kind of laughed at me. Cambridge, interestingly, had said, well, why don't you do veterinary science and then you can change into medicine, because Cambridge have a different policy in relation to changing subject. Oxford is much more constrained. And I really couldn't understand why there would be a problem, because I was so clear that it was the right thing to do. Anyway, the long and short of the story is that after some hurdles, I was able to do it. And I began to do physiological sciences and medicine in Oxford, and then I moved to London. But along the way, I'd had a series of experiences when I was younger, as a teenager, with quite severe asthma, unable to run the length of a rug pitch. And I'd had various orthodox interventions. I was one of the first people to be given Ventolin, for example, which was an amazing experience. Yeah, it was absolutely, just magical. But I was also introduced to the guy who first brought macrobiotics to Britain at the age when I was 14. And I was doing quite a lot of sport at the time, but as you can imagine, when things hit, it was awful. And within the space of a month, I found myself able to run amongst the 3 fastest in the school at the age of 16 over 3 miles, and then over 7 miles. I lost weight. I was academically
That's quite a drastic
flying.
change.
It was really amazing. Very significant dietary change. But what was particularly significant was that it opened me up to pathways of Oriental medical diagnosis. Totally different way of seeing physiology, seeing the human being. So I kind of had that background. And then when I went up to Oxford, I started to get interested in Oriental medicine. And having left Oxford, I went to St Thomas's, and I started to go and work in an acupuncture clinic near Woking once a week, and sometimes twice a week. I'd go at the weekend as well, and I'd sort of slip out from medical school, because at that time, if one was found to be, in quotes, fraternising with practitioners of fringe medicine, as it was then called, it was quite a serious issue. But that brought me face to face with very different ways of looking at people, and learning pulse diagnosis, tongue diagnosis, seeing things in a different way, and seeing remarkable outcomes. So I was kind of conflicted in some respects, because I was encountering, a very pharmaceutical and interventional approach in medical school, and I loved medical school. But then going down to this clinic and witnessing extraordinary things happening that we didn't really have a context to understand at that time. But it drove me. And when I qualified and I'd done my house jobs, during which time I'd also been studying homeopathy quietly on the side, and had a very, very powerful experience being treated. I had a bilateral pneumonitis when I was doing my surgical job in Cornwall, and I was treated by one of the great homeopaths of our time, George Vitulkas. And the experience of the impact of this ostensibly substanceless compound, as it were, that I was given, was dramatic. And I thought at the time, if this is placebo, then all I want to study for the rest of my life is placebo. But carried that into starting my junior doctor training, and was then offered the opportunity to do some research. I was challenged by my boss in Oxford on the chest unit with a guy who had chronic disabling breathlessness, young man, who'd seen 9 different specialists, and none of us were able really to help him. And Donald Lane, who was my consultant at the time, said, "What about your needles?" And they had an impact. That was, I was fairly anxious, as you might imagine.
Yeah.
And his response to that, which was so characteristic of him, was, "This is remarkable. I think we should do a study." And so we set about doing a study, which had a remarkable impact. We were looking at patients with chronic disabling breathlessness, and we used traditional Chinese acupuncture and a placebo equivalent, and had striking results that actually were published in the Lancet. So that began a trajectory of inquiry, which has just deepened through my life. Really my interest being, what is healing and why do people get sick? What is it really about? I wasn't so much wedded to any one explanatory model. Didn't really care. What I cared about was what makes people better.
Do you think you can use a mix of Western medicine with homeopathy?
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
There's no question about that. In my mind and in my practice and in my experience, I think what becomes dangerous is when things become fanatical.
Yeah.
And I don't mean that solely in relation to the alternative or complementary world. I mean that in equal measure to the orthodox so-called biomedical world. Where when one's mind becomes closed and wedded to only one explanatory model, one starts to deny so much of life experience. And people need different approaches, just like they need different diets, just like they need different forms of exercise and different forms of rest and different kinds of relationships. Every human being is unique. And I would say that after 40 years in medicine, that's one of the real take-home messages for me, is every single person is unique and they need to be treated uniquely. And when you start to lump them all together, it doesn't really work.
So this one-size-fits-all of, you've got this symptom, have this tablet.
Yeah.
You're not a fan.
It doesn't work.
No.
I mean, we know it doesn't work. The data is there. The sort of the great, I'm going to call it burden of healthcare cost in the Western world is largely because the conditions that people are presenting with are chronic, inflammatory in nature, and they don't respond to the ordinary pharmaceutical approach. These are lifestyle issues and meaning issues. It's about how people are living and why they're doing what they're doing.
So what is it you're doing now? You've got your own practice.
Yep.
Here in London, where we are now.
Yep. Well, I suppose what I'm doing now is I work with the whole person. It doesn't matter what somebody comes with. I'm interested in why they are where they're at and why they're experiencing what they're experiencing. Through the course of my time in medicine, my life to date, it's become clear to me that every person, without exception, has a purpose. It may be like Steve Jobs to build a global empire. It may be that it's very small. And there's really no difference if that is the purpose. If your purpose is to maintain a beautiful kitchen garden, then that's your purpose. And if you try to live your life in opposition to that purpose or without fulfilling that purpose, then there will be problems. And what drove me throughout my time and continues to drive me is to ask the question, why is this happening? What is this about for somebody? Why do we get sick? And I suppose it was in 1990, 91, after having been invited to give a presentation in India of the acupuncture work, the Lancet paper, I had met the Dalai Lama, who was, and most people will know, is really interested in health, well-being, mental health and spiritual health. And to cut a long story short, I was invited to give a paper in a small seminar group that he and his colleagues had brought together in Dharamsala in 1990. And this was on global health and mental peace for mankind. And, I felt wholly inadequately qualified to contribute to that. Had no idea what I was really going to talk about. In fact, I'd written back and said, I think you must have made a mistake. And I had this wonderful letter back saying, no, we haven't made a mistake, and would you like to bring people with you? And
I bet it was an experience for the
It was amazing. Yeah. Absolutely amazing. It was a wonderful experience. But, the night before, sitting up there in the Himalaya, I had no idea what I was really going to talk about. And I was sitting on a rooftop under the stars when I received the words, disease is a manifestation of health. And suddenly everything made sense. We get symptoms because the body is seeking to equilibrate and to grow and to move on. And it's not just the body, the individual as a whole. And when one sees that whatever it is that is happening for a reason, and that reason is to enable you to be the best human being that you can be, and to fulfill your potential, it changes perspective, changes everything. So I put together a presentation for that for the following day, and the people who travelled with me participated in it. It was an absolutely amazing experience. But I started to think about it a lot and to pursue it, and brought together a small study group at the time who met in Devon to discuss the notion that disease is a manifestation of health. And, this is before a lot of the stuff that's already out there now. So we're talking 1991. And I was invited to talk about it and to explore it at the Institute for Alternative Futures, which was Clinton's think tank at the time, and met with some very, very interesting people and began to put a paper together, which we published as Diseases of Meaning, Manifestations of Health and Metaphor.
I started reading that the other day. It's very interesting.
At the time it was very challenging. It took a while to put it together and to finally publish it. But the last 15, 20 years, I've really been exploring that in my practice. And it's led to a wonderful journey, a really deepening sense of order, of universal law that is expressed in every cell, every molecule, every organ, every human being in one form or another. And when one sees that there is purpose, that life does have meaning, that symptoms are helping direct a person to being the best person that they can be, then how do we explore that? How does, when someone comes in with cancer, or they've got a congenital illness, or they've, whatever it might be, psychiatric condition, by receiving someone in the context that there's nothing wrong with you. I mean, that's a shock. It's not what normally happens. I love my Western medical background. I spent 9 years developing a clinical research team with my very dear colleague and friend, Professor David Smith, looking at brain aging and dementia. So, I was schooled by some of the best. But if you keep asking the questions, and you ask, why does this happen? Why does this happen? And David was magnificent in that journey when I was an undergraduate, and then as we continued to work together. You get deeper and deeper into the physics, which ultimately is, where spirituality, science and medicine come together. And I have no doubt any longer that life has meaning, that meaning is unique to each individual. So the symptom and the meaning of the symptom will be unique to the individual. Now, whilst it may be challenging to address that in the beginning, actually, I would say the vast majority of people that I've seen, if I say to them, why do you think this has happened? Most people have an idea. Well, it all began when my auntie so-and-so did such and such to my mum. And then you find out what actually happened, and it's not the thing that happened, it's what it means to them. And the symptom will then be helping direct them to understand why that happened, what it was about, and what its message for them is. And when they get it, there's a very distinct moment of recognition in most cases. Physiology changes. Doesn't matter what the condition is.
So are we talking almost like a divine intervention, like a deity, or what are we saying?
No, I don't need to invoke a deity. Personally, God is a very real entity in my life, but I don't mean God as some being sitting on a chair. The universe is extraordinary. Universal law, the scientific law, is extraordinary. It's huge, and we can but scratch the surface. What I'm saying is that life itself, consciousness has its own mission and purpose. We are here by virtue of it. So if we can begin to sense that, and most people do actually, we can begin to work with it. And healing happens when we align and our physiology becomes more harmonious. So, stress, the great buzzword of our time.
Yeah. Do you think that's causing a lot of illness?
Huge. But you see, if you think about what I've said, for me, illness, disease, is actually a healthy response to a situation that the organism, in order to function the best it can, needs to shift, needs to change. And mostly that happens through perception. So you're not going to change a habit or a behavior unless it has meaning for you to do so, unless it brings you and enables you to work in your highest values. Values are absolutely critical to every human being. So when you think about an illness, whatever it might be, and you think about actually beginning to explore with a person that this is not an illness, this is not that there's something wrong, this is your body functioning in the right way, responding to a situation that needs to change. And that, whether that's a cold, there's a moment that you need to rest, or you need to look at your nutrition, you need to deal with the situation. There's thousands of people around you, some will have a cold and some won't. Why? Why is your immune system slightly depressed at that particular given moment? That's what becomes really interesting. So you asked me how I come to be doing what I'm doing here. It's been a long journey, it's been a long story, and I'm interested in working with the people who have really come to appreciate that what is going on in their lives has meaning for them and is about the way they live and the way they see life. Many people that I see have seen a lot of different people already, and they've come to a place where they're ready to work in a different way. So, I see people with many different conditions. I work now wholly outside the health service, because to work at this depth and in this way is pretty well impossible in the health service as we knew it.
Do you think they'll ever change?
No, I don't. I mean, I would love to be able to say, yes, I do. When I worked in Scotland for a while, we really tried to make time for people. And I worked for a period with a gastroenterologist who was very much old school, really great guy. And at the very beginning, when we started to work together, and he knew of my interest in homeopathy, which he wasn't particularly interested in, he actually said to me at the time, "I've drawn the short straw, I've got you, I've got the quack." And we actually became very, very good friends, because what happened is we would talk and he would observe. And there was one time when we were sitting talking together, and he said, "I'm noticing that your people are not coming back." So we began an exploration together, that taking the extra time to try to get underneath what was really happening in an individual. Yes, it would take, my consult might be twice as long as his, but we would get to what the nub of the issue, and the most, very often it was social or dietary, and we would begin to work with that and maybe use some homeopathy, but they wouldn't need to come back as often. So, where are the savings, and what really determines the quality of life? I was really grateful for that experience.
Yeah, I can imagine. If you go to, say, Asia or India, are their hospitals a mixture of?
Yes.
Yeah, they are.
Yeah, absolutely.
So their mainstream is a mixture of Western and Eastern.
Yes, I mean, if you go to India, you will see. We have this raging debate here about the use of homeopathy within the health service. Sadly driven by, in my opinion, a very destructive use of the magic of science and the scientific method. What is interesting is that these old so-called alternatives seem to provoke very deep psychological responses and emotional responses in people. Just as witchcraft did in years gone by, and the test for whether someone was a witch or not would inevitably mean that they would drown on the way to fulfilling the test. And it's kind of similar here. You go to India, and there are tens of millions of people being treated with homeopathy on a daily basis, and very effectively. If one were to actually take the time, get the right group of people together, and start to go and look and evaluate, you will see extraordinary things that defy our ordinary explanation. And I don't really mind if people want to invoke the placebo. More and more people in the medical arena are more and more deeply interested in what constitutes placebo, not as a negative, but much more, how can we harness that self-healing ability? And I happen to, it's beyond a belief now, from 40 years of experience, to see that the triggers to healing are many and varied, and taking the time at the beginning of a consultation to understand where someone is coming from internally, the basis on which they make their decisions and their belief systems, opens the door to harnessing their healing in a different way. So, slightly off from your question, but yes, if you go to India, you'll see there are 4 main different forms of medicine, and there are hospitals and clinics all over the country. And there is orthodox Western biomedical medicine. Same in China, and same in other parts of the world.
Used in conjunction.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I suppose here, is it, I don't want to get all conspiracy theory, but is it the big pharmaceutical companies that maybe push against it, or?
Well, we don't have to invoke conspiracy. It's commonly said, if you want to understand where a problem is originating, follow the money. We have a model, a framework with which we view physiology, biochemistry, molecular and cellular function. And the pharmaceutical industry has grown out of that model with, what used to be the notion of the discovery of a magic bullet that could, deal with an issue. We used to say at the time, a pill for every ill. And, I worked very closely with the pharmaceutical industry at one point because we were funded by the pharmaceutical industry in our research in Oxford.
But did that drive a certain way you had to work?
Yes. Absolutely it did. I mean, it's profit motivated. It has to be. When we made the discovery that homocysteine and the B vitamin profile in an individual is causally related to the origin and progression of some of the dementias, the pharmaceutical company that funded the work weren't interested because they can't patent folic acid, for example. So they then set about trying to modify the molecule so they could have a patent. It's a particular thought form. It doesn't drive healing. I believe that we're on the threshold of one of the greatest transformations in biomedical science that we'll ever see, because the reality of energy and of different forms of energy and being able to interact and intervene using those different forms of energy is now breaking in on the way that we see cellular and physiological function, which of course, in other cultures they've been aware of for a very long time.
It's fascinating stuff. So at the moment, if anyone wants to, so I go to a doctor, for example, would I have to get a referral, or do you just totally bypass the whole system?
You can bypass the whole system.
Bypass the whole system.
I mean, I'm a great believer in communication. So, when a patient comes to see me, I always want to know who the GP is, and I want to communicate with the GP. It's really important. It underpins our whole health service. But, I'm the way I function, the way I work, and looking at the whole person and being interested in their diet, their nutrition, the kind of nutrition that they might have, lifestyle, exercise, relationship, everything which goes to making for an experience of health. People can come to me directly and they can be referred.
And you're functional shift consulting, isn't it?
That's it.
Yeah. And you've got nutritional shift as well.
I've got nutritional shift where we sell our nutrients and this is another whole subject.
Yeah, I'd like to talk about that as well, if we can.
By all means.
We're going to shoot around topics a bit, but we'll get back. So nutritional shift, talk about your company. So you're providing different...
So nutrients are manufactured in different ways. Nutritional supplementation. If you think about it, what are they there for? They're there to try to bolster, support, replace food. The way in which we have evolved over billions of years is to derive our nutrition from largely plant-based sources. The minerals and vitamins that we get from the roots and the plants, the fruits, are in a particular form, which we call the food state form. The vast majority of nutritional supplements that you purchase from most of the outlets, Boots and Mullen & Barrett and the others, are chemically synthesized salts. They don't look anything like the form that you would see it in the food. It's very simple.
Okay.
It's just factual. And when you seek to absorb the salt, the chemical salts, the chemical form, that are often also different isomers of what you would see in the plants, you can absorb very little. One says round about 5 to 10% most of the time.
So you take these, say, multivitamins from Boots, etc., you're barely absorbing anything?
You're not going to be absorbing a huge amount. If you take, some of the nutrients, common, calcium, iron, magnesium, vitamin C, when you actually look at the structure of the food form, there are usually anything between 80 and 100 different components that make up that nutrient in the natural form. We have evolved to see that. Let me give you an analogy. Let's say that somebody did a very simple line cartoon of you and gave it to me. I might recognize that it's you. I might not. But I can't touch it, I can't talk with it, I can't put my arm around it, I can't say hi Jack and shake your hand. I can't do anything with it, I might just recognize it. You walk into the room and we can have this conversation.
Yeah.
The difference between many of the synthesized nutrients and the food form is the equivalent of the cartoon drawing and you walking into the room. We can engage with it. So when the food form comes into the body knows, it recognizes it instantaneously, knows exactly where to direct it, what to do with it. So it is not only absorbed more, but it is assimilated better. So we generally say as a rule of thumb that, for example, if you're having the food form magnesium or calcium, you will absorb 90 to 95% of it. Whereas if you take the salt that's available in other forms, you might be lucky to get 10%, 10, maybe 15 max. That's a huge difference.
That is huge.
And you feel very different. So let me give you a very obvious example that any women that may be listening to this will know. You give a woman iron in its ordinary form as a supplement, usually ferrous sulfate or ferrous gluconate. They feel sick, they get constipated, they don't like taking it, and it doesn't really shift the hemoglobin. It does a bit. You give them food state, there's no nausea, there's no constipation, and it shifts function dramatically. It was my colleague Eric Llewellyn's suggestion that I give somebody the food state iron that transformed my approach to what I was doing. It was just breathtaking. Somebody who needed to have transfusion twice a year because she had such terribly heavy periods, and she couldn't take the ordinary form of iron. So with some persuasion, she agreed to our giving her a trial of the food state iron. And a month later, she walked into my office. Her hemoglobin had gone up by 3 points, and she just said to me, "What have you done? I just feel so different." So,
super.
Proof is in the pudding.
So, do you think people just don't know about this? Is it just a matter of getting the word out there? Because
yes. I mean, it's certainly a matter of getting the word out there. People don't know about it. There is some research, there is some evidence, not a huge amount. Those who are in the know and who use it, they're not particularly interested in necessarily getting more. Obviously, that would require investment and time. I would love to see it done. So for example, I've always been interested. There are big studies out there that show that nutritional supplementation doesn't make that much difference. There are other studies that do. I suspect that the majority that show that it doesn't make that much difference have been using chemically synthesized forms of nutritional supplementation. And of course, it's quite true. It doesn't make that much difference.
Yeah.
It's absolutely correct.
I presume it's cheaper to create the synthesized one.
Yes.
But then obviously you're not absorbing as much. So
That's
effectively,
right.
To absorb the same amount, you'd be spending more money.
Well, yes, but you'd also be getting side effects. I mean, there are side effects from some of this supplementation. High doses of ascorbic acid, as vitamin C, for example, makes the inner environment more acidic and can give rise to problems with bowel function. When you take it in its food state form, you just don't get that problem.
That's interesting. Fascinating.
That's why nutritional shift exists. I mean, it's there for our patients, and very happy to make it available to others.
So if anyone wants to check that out, that's Nutritional Shift, just give it a Google. You were given an award by Desmond Tutu, was it?
Yes, I was.
Tell me about that.
Totally unexpected. Completely unexpected. I was in India I think it was 2013. And there as part of a conference on integrative medicine with my dear friend and colleague, Dr. Isaac Matai. And there was an announcement in the presentation that Desmond Tutu was making that this award was going to be made, and I was its recipient. So it was an award for a Lifetime Achievement Award for services to integrative medicine.
That's pretty impressive.
It was great.
Yeah. What was it like meeting him?
Oh, he's just a lovely human being.
Is he?
Yeah. So down to earth, really super guy.
So what are they doing out in India then, if you don't mind me asking? Is that just a main hub for it, or?
Well, Saukya, which is where I was, and I have worked with Dr. Matai since he first began to build Southcare after 1989, is a very exclusive centre for healing that integrates naturopathic approaches, Ayurvedic approaches, homeopathic approaches, and has on tap any of the orthodox specialties that might be needed. He follows the ancient Ayurvedic principles in the way in which diagnosis is made and patients are treated. And I was there because I've supported that work, and I've supported his international foundation ever since it began. But India as a source of different approaches to healing is a magnificent resource. I mean, there's so much there. But it's not the be-all and end-all, and it's not the answer to everything. You know, we need a synthesis of the best of each of the worlds, and we need the honesty and integrity to be able to examine what we're doing and ask about whether there are other ways, simpler ways, less invasive ways, more cost-effective ways.
Even like you say, I suppose that comes down to who's funding it, though, don't it? Because we were talking before the podcast, and I was saying I know somebody who was feeling down for a couple of weeks, went into the doctor's surgery, and they're like, "Oh, you're feeling depressed, have these tablets." But they hadn't got to the root cause of why they're feeling depressed. They hadn't told them to exercise to release endorphins or anything like that. I'm not even a doctor. I know if you go out for a run, you're going to feel better, or stop drinking too much alcohol. So they just throw tablets at people.
Absolutely. I mean, I think we're in crisis. I think there would be many medics and surgeons in our country who, if one was able to create a safe space for them to speak, who would share the view that life is very tough, it's overburdened, it's overstressed, and therapeutic avenues are very limited. I mean, I can't imagine just how awful it must be when all you've got is prescription pad and a very full waiting room with ever tightening medical legal constraints. It's really not easy. And I want to make it very clear in our exchange that polarization in terms of an us and them between integrative health or alternative health, complementary health, and the bad boys of orthodox medicine doesn't help anybody. Having said that, with your friend, it's tragic that would be the first response of a physician who ostensibly went into medicine in the very beginning because they care. It's tough training. It's, in my opinion, it's a very narrow training. And in some respects, it breeds the compassion out in order, just to be able to succeed. The volume of information. And my son is in first year of medical school, and it's been quite something to re-witness what that means and how hard it is to hold on to the vision that you have of wanting to be a healer and wanting to care for people and broaden your vision. So part of the situation that we're in is because of circumstance. But then when you go deeper, why is this the circumstance? Well, it's because of the way we see things. So it's a kind of vicious, self-sustaining circle, and to break out of it takes courage. But I believe that we will ultimately. I think the crisis that we face in healthcare, and that's very much cost-driven, is what is going to breed its solution, just as the crisis we faced with horse-drawn carriages and piles of manure has led to the evolution of the car. And now we're going to have to do something else.
This ties in well with one of my last podcasts, because people are coming in to doctor surgery to say maybe, I've got a bad knee. Well, that's probably because you're overweight and you've got an unhealthy lifestyle, you're eating too much. But they just treat the superficial thing, don't they, rather than...
Obviously, that's the case in some instances. It's not always the case.
No,
I mean, we've just
always.
talked
Yeah, we do.
about a very challenging situation that you brought for us to explore. With the work, I think it's fair to say really that over the last 15, 20 years, what my work has been about at a personal level has been my own research of what I call the science of meaning. So the paper, Diseases of Meaning, Manifestations of Health and Metaphor, was written and titled as it was titled because one of my co-authors on that, who is very, very politically active in the medical and scientific scene, said to me at the time, if you call this paper Disease as a Manifestation of Health, which is what I wanted to do, he said it's too strong and the public isn't ready for it. We had a very long debate about it. And ultimately I acceded to his suggestion, and I think it was the right one. But what it's really about is this whole issue of the central importance of perception and meaning. And if you think about it, the meaning that you give to things is what determines how you will respond to it and behave in relation to it. So if we see human beings and human physiology in a particular light, through a particular lens, that is what we will see. If in fact it's much wider than that, then we're missing it. We're looking through a filter. And what I've been looking at is just quietly, with each case ultimately I see each person that I see as their own research study. And once one starts to open it up, you start to realize that there are many, 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 many different influences that are at play, that the matrix is huge, it's real, it exists, that entanglement is a very real thing, and that when one person, for example, in a family situation shifts perception or changes, it affects everybody. When that happens in an organization, it's the same. When that happens in a research institution, it's the same. So, and that's global. Now we know it more and more. We've got the internet. We've got communications taking place using very subtle technologies and signals. We're receiving information from way out in space. We're integrating that information. We're getting ever deeper view that particle physics, functions according to certain laws. It's functioning inside every single molecule, every single atom that is in the body. If one takes that really on board, and you realize that actually each particle is nothing but space, that has huge implications. Now, this is real science. I'm not interested in it being woo-woo or foofy-doof and out there in that sense. I'm really not. What I'm interested in is what helps heal and what sustains life. And the scientists who are right out there at the cutting edge are talking with spiritual leaders because actually they're there dealing with similar concepts. We need the same in medicine, and it's one of the tragedies that, it's commonly said that medicine advances at the pace of the death of its elders because they become so wedded to ways of thinking. We have an opportunity to make a huge difference now. And it's one of the most exciting things that your friend going to a doctor, for example, who sees that, yes, there is a biomolecular manifestation, but that biomolecular manifestation is not the cause. It is the result of an inner perception, of a set of meanings, of situations that are happening in their life. So if you can ask the question, when did this happen? What do you think is going on and how are you feeling? And then explore what that might mean. You open the door to transforming the situation without having to use a pill that has side effects. Now, that's not to say that pills aren't necessary. Of course they are. But it becomes much more interesting, in my opinion, and much more exciting to take the former approach. Now, what is also interesting is that approach is as scientific as anything else. Human behavior is a science. Human psychology is a science. Human emotions, there is always the positive and the negative always go together to create balance. And symptoms emerge when we hold charges about things. When we hold charges, that means that we're not seeing the other side. If we can open up perception, the charge will often balance, the symptom will disappear, the lesson has been obtained, and you move on to the next level.
It's fascinating stuff. Because we're saying, like, on a scientific level, your emotions will directly influence what happens in your body, won't they?
Mm-hmm.
So, like, stress, the actual response to that is, I was talking on the last one, is like, in a basic form, is inflammation, isn't it? But it's released certain hormones which have a direct impact on your health in general.
Yes.
But I think everyone seems to forget that for some reason. I suppose it's hard, isn't it, when you're stuck in there yourself?
Well, you know, I have, like others in the profession, seen many patients who've said, just give me a pill so that I can get back to doing what I was doing before. They're not ready, and I don't mean that in a derogatory sense, to start to look at the fact that what they were doing before has led to the problem. Often somebody has to get significantly ill before they will begin to really explore what might be going on and be willing to make a change. Sometimes that only happens when they face death. I'm not afraid of death. And I think it's one of the sad things in our medical training that we don't really explore it and talk about it and open to it because, you know, let's face it, it's the one thing we all know we're going to face.
Well, that and taxes, as they say.
Yeah. Yes, that's true too. And for students today, you know, this huge burden of loans.
Yeah.
I think in opening the whole subject of death, we offer people a chance to get a reality check, and then often a different kind of dialogue will emerge. But, you know, I mean, I also want to make it clear that, you know, this is what I'm talking about now is just to say it again, this is not about a polarization. This is not about saying, you know, if you've got cancer, you don't have chemotherapy or you don't have radiotherapy. Each person's path, each person's trajectory is unique. And people know what is right for them. They're going to die anyway, at some point, with or without cancer. You know, there are plenty of reports of people who stop their chemotherapy, who stop their radiotherapy and recover. They have a different kind of trajectory. They might go off on some alternative route, which may or may not have had the impact. We know that chemotherapy and radiotherapy, for example, can make people significantly worse, that the symptoms, you know, are sometimes crucifying. The profession is doing its best, it's trying, it's exploring, but it's exploring within a very narrow window. And it also lives with a level of uncertainty that can be very difficult to take. It's hard to do nothing. Yet, interestingly, if one can do nothing but open a space for people to talk, sometimes remarkable things happen. And when you can combine those approaches, one sees miracles, literally.
So would you say if someone had something wrong with them, for example, and you were going into a doctor, say you had cancer, how do you know whether you should be going for chemotherapy? I know that sounds like a very hard question to answer, but if I've seen it quite a few times with people, and they sort of just, like we said with the depression, it's like a one size fits all. So, you've got cancer, chemotherapy straight away type thing. And I know that's not always the case, but if that was you, how would you take responsibility like yourself and say, well,
this is very, very hard.
Do you have to try? Would it be a money situation? Do you have to pay a good consultant to try and determine whether you do need it, or?
If you want to take an alternative path, money is an issue. There are institutions that are beginning to embrace an integrative approach. Increasingly. Though your question has to be one of the hardest questions, because there is no right or wrong answer. my own view is that each person has a right to the information, and that each person will be able to feel their way into what is right for them. I've got patients who have very definitely embraced an integrated approach along with their orthodox treatment. I've got patients who have said, we don't want it. I don't tell people one way or the other. I open a space to explore it. I don't have all of the information. That information is out there to be got. It is extremely difficult sometimes to get that information, and it's very difficult to get it honestly. There are all kinds of sites and options out there on the net to get information. It's fraught.
Yeah,
it's really fraught.
So when you're researching, you've got to look at sources. It cannot be day from down the road. But if you find, I suppose, a study from a research institute, say a well-respected university maybe, even though we've said that they're quite limited by their parameters, I suppose, of the funding, I suppose you've got to check the source of where you're getting your information, haven't you?
You do, and it's also important to remember that the growth of any discipline is often influenced by what was initially either outlawed or disrespected. You take, for example, the treatment of stomach ulceration and the discovery of Helicobacter pylori. The guy who made that suggestion, who made that discovery, was ostracized and ridiculed for a long time.
So what was this? So he had an
ostracization? He was the person who identified that there is a bacterium that underpins some of the evolution of gastric ulceration. And for a long period of time, this was completely ridiculed as being ridiculous. Now it's mainline standard treatment. But he endured a very, very, very difficult time during that process. And he's not alone. That is the story of the evolution of thought, science, and medicine.
Similar to what you were saying you found when you were researching at Oxford.
Yeah.
They didn't want to push that idea.
No. It doesn't fit. And there's a lot written. Kuhn has written about the evolution of paradigms and how we understand paradigms. It's what has driven me to perception and meaning. So I work with that in each individual. I think the greatest shift that is going to happen is not that we try to change the way that the profession sees things. It may come. I think the fulfillment of my life's work, for example, will be when the science of meaning is taught in primary schools. If as a child you gain access to how perception influences cellular function, how it influences your physiology and your way of being in the world, how amazing a tool would that be? Instead of having to become, to go all the way through and get sick.
Yeah.
That's where my thinking is going now.
That's what I was going to lead on to. So I was going to say, we got a few other questions, but
yeah.
What's planned for you then? What's happening?
Well, this work is taking me, and I say taking me because I really feel led by it, deeper and deeper into the whole issue of purpose. If you believe, as I do, that each human being, that the life of each human being has meaning, even if that person says, I don't believe that life particularly has meaning and that it's all over when you die and, you get buried. Actually, that is a thought form. It has meaning and it has consequence. And it influences the way that people live. So it doesn't matter which way you look at it, from where you come. You don't have to invoke any deity. I don't need to invoke a deity to do this work. I'm really happy to have the discussion and to go as deep as it is possible for us to go into the science and the physics, because ultimately that's That's where it goes. It has to go. But what I'm discovering, or what is being revealed, on the one hand is new, and on the other hand it's ancient. It's not new. Purpose defines how we live. When we come to what that is for us, life changes. Depression, for example, if we take depression, take your friend, the symptom is a feedback mechanism. It's a feedback mechanism that something needs to be looked at, something needs to be balanced out, perception needs to shift. The beauty is that you can change the chemistry by changing perception. You can change perception, which will change meaning, or you can change meaning, which will change perception. They are completely interrelated. That is a science. It's magical. We don't fully understand how it works, but that's how we're made. So I am increasingly working with people, and have been working with the ideas of my very dear friend and colleague, Dr. DiMartini, on how this actually works. How does the science manifest? What is the basis of its evolution? How do we shift perception? How do we enable people to grow in their meaning? And so I'm more and more interested in working with people who have influence in particular, whose every decision affects the lives of millions of people, on defining and clarifying purpose. And because that affects so much. And I'm then interested in how do we get there? How do we describe it? How do we use it to make decisions, which links us into what we talked about a little bit earlier, values. How do we determine values? Because if you function outside your highest values, you will ultimately sabotage yourself in one form or another. And that may be through life events, it may be through symptoms, it may be through illness, it may be through relationships. So if you take those approaches and you then ask the question, how can I use this information to help me make decisions in my life, especially if my life is in some way in crisis? Now, I find often that people with enormous responsibility and power will be functioning in their professional lives in a certain way, but their personal lives may be in chaos, or vice versa. I'm working at the moment on how to use the information that we gain in finding purpose, which we call telos, which means the end in mind in Greek, to help define strategy for moving forwards. Now that can be in relation to a diagnosis like cancer, which I'm doing with people, or it can be in trying to treat or approach stress. Because when something is stressful, it's because of a perception that we have. So I might be feeling completely stressed out by a situation, and you'd come in and say, "Oh, it's a breeze, Kim," because it relates to our values in different ways. So I'm really interested in how we pursue that and how we help people get clarity and strategy as a result of that, both within the healthcare arena and very much within life and lifestyle.
Do you think there'll be more publications in the future?
Yes, for sure.
Yeah, it's a very interesting topic. So this podcast, we focus a lot. I ask everyone basically this question: based on your experiences, what is the key to success, or are the keys, if there's multiple?
Great question. Okay, so that's a great question. Love it. But it invokes a question. What do you mean by success?
I suppose it's almost subjective, isn't it? I've had that question before as well. But I suppose success, it's almost going to come back to what you've been saying about doing not necessarily what your purpose is, but enjoying your life, I suppose. That'll be success, wouldn't it? If you've enjoyed your life, you're successful, I suppose.
So let's take success. There are different components to success. But each person has a notion of what success is to them at that moment in time. So there may be a time in someone's life where financial wealth is their measure of success. For others, it may be getting married and having a family is their notion of success. For others, it may be research and discovering, something in science, or the creation of a great work of art, or even not a great work of art. So in answering your question, my first response is first find out what success means to someone.
What does it mean to you?
Success to me will be that I have lived my life without regret. That when I come to take my last breath, I have no regrets.
I like that definition.
And that's it's what it has done over the last 10, 15 years is create in me a filter, a window, a lens. And it requires a level of honesty and authenticity that can be very, very challenging and sometimes very painful. But just to come back to your question, if we discover what success means to an individual, what it means to me, the way for me to fulfill that is to know what my values are. My values, Kim's values. They're not yours. They're unique to me. And what is interesting is that in our educational system, in my experience, we don't encourage a real celebration of individual values. We see academic success as being a measure of success. So, that wonderful quote of Einstein's, if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, then it's not going to be very successful. Well,
that's very true.
And this is the same in school.
Yeah.
It's tragic. And that's, in a way, this is very, very symbolic of what's happening in medicine. Our educational system has become really rather narrow and academically focused one way and another. Especially that's the case in medicine. We have this tough first part that doesn't nurture sensitivity, compassion, human relationship, those skills. It's head stuff. So let's say that we've established what success might mean for somebody, which means that we've done the work to find out what their values are. Then the measure of success will be the extent to which they have been able to fulfill those values. And that will be expressed in their energy, their vitality, their health, and their relationships.
Would you go about pursuing that at all costs?
Yes.
Yes.
I have no
there was no hesitation. No.
Absolutely.
Well, I think we've covered most of the points I wanted to cover. Have you got anything you'd like to leave our listeners with?
Yes. And it's a challenging statement. The longer I live and the more work I do, the more I realize that it is love that underpins everything. Even really the traumatic events and incidents that are occurring in the world. And that is a manifestation of balance. That the way in which the physics functions, the way in which life functions, it is actually always and everywhere in perfect balance. We just don't see it. And that the journey to understanding that, to seeing it, appreciating it, and being able to work with it is the journey to health. Now, I know that's a challenging statement. It's as challenging as saying that disease is a manifestation of health. But the beauty of it is that it leads one to a place where one can begin to appreciate that there is an order, and I would call it a divine order, that order functions according to scientific laws, that we can work with them, that they are expressed in every single human being, and that if we come to understand them and we work with them, amazing things can happen.
I like that. We'll leave you all with that. That's very good. Well, Kim, thank you for coming on.
It's a real pleasure.
So that was our 6th podcast. I hope you enjoyed it. To find out more about Kim and what he does, either visit functionalshift.com or nutritionalshift.com for the supplements we were talking about. Our next podcast is with Premiership Rugby's Guy Thompson, which will no doubt be an interesting listen. He's had a successful career so far at Wasps, and he's just signed for Leicester Tigers, so I'm looking forward to hearing how he got to where he is. If you haven't already, make sure you subscribe to our weekly newsletter at breakingthenorm.blog. It's a 2-minute email you'll get every Monday with a bit of positive news, link to book recommendations, and link to our latest podcasts. Thank you. Bye.